A common theme within my work these past few years has been the collusion, hypocrisy, extremist rhetoric, activism, and punishing of wrongthink that has overtaken the field of game journalism. I've also delved deep into the weaponization of various identities that this group often engages in. It's no secret they bludgeon people down with false accusations of homophobia and transphobia in any attempt to get their way. And perhaps no single story best exemplifies my points better than the transgender debacle surrounding Cyberpunk 2077. As you'll see, this one contains it all. So take a swig of Chromanticore, put on your light up sneakers, and jack your brain into the screen. Because we're about to dive deep into the manipulative side of the medium, and where we're going, not even Keanu can keep us safe. Six months post-release, a lot has been said about Cyberpunk 2077. Releasing in an unfinished state, with bugs and glitches galore, one of the most hotly anticipated games of the entire generation landed with the grace of a sloppy fart inside a funeral parlor. Now, that's not to say it wasn't fun, and as I expressed in my very own review, there's a lot of enjoyment to be had. From its story and characters to the over-the-top violence that stems from using a dildo as a weapon, the game maintains a certain level of chaotic silliness. But should someone outright hate the experience, I can't fault them for it. The title is hardly above criticism, and there's tons of valid critique abound, even within the dreaded world of game journalism. I go out of my way to emphasize this point because I want to make it clear that this video isn't here to discuss the quality CP 2077 launched in, the many issues it has suffered since, or the craziness erupting behind the scenes at its development studio, CD Projekt Red. Nor does this video exist to attack people who have critiques about any of those aspects. As already stated, many criticisms levied towards the title are totally fair, and I say this regardless of if they line up with my own opinions or not. Instead, I want to address a singular narrative that arose in the years leading up to the release of CP 2077, that being the gender politicking surrounding the title and the ridiculous lengths the media went to decry the experience as transphobic. I know this many months removed from release that it's a seemingly random topic to return to, but I believe it's an important point of discussion, and as you'll see at the end of this video, it ties together many topics I've previously discussed, and it'll touch on topics I plan to break down in future videos. So without further ado, let's get into this. It's a bit of a doozy. In June 2018, Cyberpunk 2077 gameplay was finally shown to journalists in the behind-closed-doors demo at that year's E3 convention. The session became a huge focal point given the hype already surrounding the title, and what followed was a deluge of articles further hyping the experience. In hindsight, there's a lot to be said about the way the media was tricked by a vertical slice, and the way they basically contributed to the marketing side of the hype machine. But this video isn't going to dive deep into that aspect. Just know I recognize and acknowledge it. That aside, during a demo, a handful of journalists noticed the character creator was limited to male and female gender options, and it was at that particular moment when the gender controversy was first seeded within the mainstream pantheon. Writing for Waypoint Games, aka Vice, Patrick Klepek, because of course it was him, published an article headlined CD Projekt Red won't commit to gender fluidity in Cyberpunk 2077 yet. Within the piece, he claims to have immediately noticed limited gender options during the E3 presentation, and upon asking a studio representative if the game would feature alternative genders, he wasn't given a solid no. Following this minor revelation, Klepek reveals his belief that the game should embrace non-binary pronouns because, and I'm using his words here, it would be socially important to do so. As anyone familiar with my content is aware, I've been calling game journalists the term jacktivists for a while now. This means activist journalists, and the reason is because for nearly a decade, those within the medium have used their platforms to push forward various social and political agendas, and this politicalization of the medium has in turn led to an incredibly one-sided affair, one in which anyone outside of a very rigid environment of groupthink is thrown under the bus. We saw this in my Clique piece where I revealed how game journalists are blockading people with opposing views from attaining careers at any of the mainstream gaming websites, and we've seen this time and time again with the attempted and or successful cancellations of people such as Daniel Vavra, Colin Moriarty, Tim Saray, Scott Cawthon, Troy Levitt, and many, many others. We've also seen attacks levied towards games that don't suit their rigid worldview. Consider the recent 6 Days in Fallujah controversy where people within gaming pushed forward a petition that legitimately asked governments to step in and censor a game. I go on this tangent because while what they are doing is blatantly obvious to anyone on the outside, they remain committed to denying it. So within the Klepek piece, it should stand out that he published a tacit admission to wanting to use gaming as a means of social and political change. And as you'll see very shortly, the press would soon fall in line and go to extreme lengths to push for that change. Why Cyberpunk 2077 was chosen as an outlet for non-binary rage cannot be said for certain, especially considering all the games that continue to release with only 2 gender options and the lack of controversy surrounding those. But my guess is that it has to do with it being the most anticipated game of its time. CP 2077 was huge for search engine optimization, so what better platform to force in political lobbying? Not to mention RageBait does wonders for clicks. Although even that doesn't fully explain it, considering few websites bothered to cover the 2-gender system in those early summer days. Because following the publication of the article in Vice, only a small handful of sites jumped into the fray. Really, outside of some tweets and a few forum posts, the notion wasn't really catching on, and frankly, it just seemed like no one cared that the game was limited to male or female. Which, when you think about it, makes sense. Only a small portion of the population identifies as non-binary, and a 2-gender system is hardly exclusionary. Contrary to what some would like you to believe, 2 genders are inclusive of trans people. The whole notion of being trans is that you identify as the gender opposite of what your physical being was born as. Therefore, being able to play as female if you're biologically male, or vice versa, is enough. As for non-binary people, I'll play ball. Just please bear with me for a moment as a gigantic but will follow this. Okay, so I admittedly struggle to accept the concept. As a trans person myself, I am not fond of non-binary people being lumped under the trans umbrella, and in a lot of ways, I think being non-binary is more emblematic of a counterculture, a way for typically hyper-woke individuals to fight back against gender norms and stereotypes. Or in other rarer instances, I think people who identify as NB are just confused. But, and this is a big but, regardless of my own personal views towards that identity, I understand that people want to see themselves within the games they play, and in that sense, I don't think more customization options are a bad thing. If developers have the time and resources to give players more options, then more power to them. My favorite character creators are the ones that let me go crazy. Think Saints Row and such. The problem here is that time and resources must go into developing such character creators, and in the case of Cyberpunk, it's not as easy as giving the player the option to choose a they/them set of pronouns. Huge portions of the game would need to be re-recorded and reassembled to make all the various side characters and NPCs properly address the protagonist. Likewise, all the romance options would need to be redone. It's not a simple or quick process, and in a game where Keanu fucking Reeves is one of the major characters, that's a costly venture to re-record bits of dialogue. And in all my digging, I found that almost no outlet mentions this fact. VGR is one of the only websites to point out the obvious, which is a statement of how much extra work additional pronouns would take. Keep in mind that for years, gaming outlets have been calling gamers entitled, and here they are demanding more developer time and money just to add they/them pronouns to a game. An act of entitlement that goes even further when you consider just how often they bash the studio for its culture of crunch. Backtracking to the topic at hand, at those early stages, it's possible the blooming non-binary narrative could have wilted and died. As mentioned, outside of some tweets and a few forum posts and articles, the notion wasn't really catching on. But thanks to a series of public relations blunders, this would not last, and a small talking point erupted into something massive. On July 17th, 2018, CDPR's parent company GOG posted a tweet with a GIF from Postal 2 Paradise Lost. The moving image depicted a tombstone memorializing the suicidal death of game journalism actively being urinated upon. At face value, it was just an edgy tweet to mark a notoriously edgy game. Where Postal is concerned, it was genuinely nothing out of the ordinary. But ordinary, this story is not, and the gaming press and its allies lost its collective shit. The anger went so far that VG247 vowed to cease all coverage of GOG's website, claiming it was blowing dog whistles to the hate group Gamergate, and even game developer Phil Fish ceased selling his immensely popular game Fez on the platform. Interestingly though, while the tweet was posted on a Tuesday, the outrage machine didn't turn on right away. It wasn't until Wednesday when Zoe Quinn replied to it with her typical woe is me rhetoric, and then the gaming media and its allies fell in line. Reset Era would make a thread on the 19th, and that same day is when VG247 and PC Games Insider published articles. It's here where I think it's proper to go on a quick tangent about Zoe Quinn. I'm not going to rehash the entirety of Gamergate in this video, as that will be a daunting epic to address at another time. But what you need to know now is that Zoe Quinn was one of the key players of the ordeal, and it was her close ties with various game journalists which kicked off the entire debacle. It's those close ties and the media's refusal to address serious ethical issues surrounding her that get many gamers, myself included, into a bit of a tizzy. As an example of the issues I'm alluding to, consider this. As of the writing of the script, it's now been 1,045 days since she last updated backers as to the whereabouts of a project in which she was given $85,000, a project she has obviously never delivered upon. When the Kickstarter campaign launched in October of 2016, she claimed the game was nearly done and was a mere few months away from completion. Being she's active friends with many people in the press, during the crowdfunding stage it was promoted on quite a few websites. In some of these instances, those boosting it were personal friends of hers, and nowhere was this conflict of interest disclosed. Fast forward almost 2 years, and on August 30th, 2018, a mere week and a half after the press lost its mind over the GOG marketing tweet dunking on game journalism, Zoe Quinn published the last update her backers ever got. It's here where she claimed to have no money to finish the project, while at the same time she was literally vacationing in Japan. And a handful of months after that last update, she was financially backing other people's projects. In any rational person's mind, this should raise some red flags, or at the very least, questions. But outside of my own coverage, as of today, not a single mainstream website has addressed the whereabouts of her project. This is a problem because the press, aka her friends, not only initially boosted the project and helped it raise $85K, but multiple journalists literally helped work on the pre-alpha build of the game. Yet thanks to the narrative they spent years cultivating as it pertains to Gamergate, any attempt to call out these ethical violations is met with cries from the press that whoever is doing the pointing is a bigot, or worse. Just keep this in mind every time they bring up Gamergate. Getting back on track, following the controversy surrounding GOG's tweet, a few more websites picked up where Vice originally left off and began publishing articles lamenting the lack of gender options in Cyberpunk 2077, with the Daily Dot even going on a spiel about how trans representation was entirely missing from the game. A commentary which in retrospect is sort of funny considering the game has a trans character voiced by a trans woman, and she's one of the best characters within the entire game. At least in my opinion. But as with other things, I'll touch upon Claire a bit later, because first I want to get into the second Twitter controversy. On August 21st, 2018, the official CP 2077 Twitter account replied to someone with a "did you just assume their gender" joke, and faster than one could say the word meme, the media readied their scopes and took aim at the company for what they claimed was an act of transphobia. Perhaps it was Polygon that went the most overboard, so that's what I'll focus on. In an article headlined "Cyberpunk's transphobic tweet is part of a much larger issue within game marketing," the writer of the piece, William Antonelli, follows the lead of VG247 from a month prior and describes the tweet as a dog whistle. His reasoning being that the "did you just assume my gender" meme is meant to paint trans folk as overly aggressive, anal, and shrill about wanting their gender to be respected. To which it's here that I must once again interject, because the magic of memes is that they're ever evolving, and to most people, well, they take on countless meanings. As a trans person, I've even made that joke, and in my perspective, it stems from there being a silly amount of supposed genders and the aloofness of social media where each day we see bearded men claiming to be female. On top of that, it seems like every other week a new set of pronouns is being created. And I'm sorry, but if you jump into the social conversation demanding people call you Z and Zai or Fae and Fair, and that anything else is transphobic, well then people are gonna make memes about it. I'll try to save most of my trans rants for another time, but there's no denying that a tidal wave of ridiculousness has overswept the gender discourse. As it pertains to the CP2077 tweet, I interpret it as a harmless joke. The writer of those words wasn't considering the implications of its origin or what it might mean to others. They were merely repeating a common meme, one which in various forms has been circulating online for years. It was normie speak. Back to the Polygon piece, it doubles down on the joke being transphobic while taking aim at GOG's apology, before then going on a weird rant about how exhausting it is to be a trans person on the internet, even describing it as a form of self-harm. I don't know. Like, what the fuck? Now I can only speak from my own experience, and that of my partner and a few close friends, but we run within gaming circles and Warhammer 40k circles and other areas within nerd and online culture, and the internet isn't exhausting for us, nor is it rife with abuse. That's not to say that harassment doesn't exist, it certainly does, but it's nowhere near as widespread as some like to pretend. Most often these types take any form of criticism and write it off as transphobia. Their identities become a shield. At the risk of jumping too far ahead, let me say that we saw this all throughout the cyberpunk gender discourse, but I'm going to shelve this point for now. Let's instead once again return to the Polygon piece, because, as if following a guidebook, the author again repeats rhetoric set forth by VG247, and while discussing the GOG tweet from a month prior, brings Gamergate into the fray, suggesting the company is supporting a movement which took aim at marginalized communities, such as trans folk and such. The July tweet the writer states as proof that they have a history of flirting with transphobia and the groups that perpetuate it, ignoring that I'm a trans journalist within the Gamergate space. As if all that wasn't bad enough, the author then cites the trans murder rate and the supposed real-world harm such jokes can lead to. I will try to make this quick, but the murder rate would continue to be cited by other gaming websites as the months wore on, and so I need to address this. The trans murder rate is fucking horseshit. It is political propaganda at its finest. Please bear with me once again, it's tangent time. On September 16th, 2017, Scout Schultz charged Georgia Tech police with a knife, an action which resulted in Scout being shot and killed. Months prior, Sean Hake of Sharon, Pennsylvania was killed by law enforcement after his mom called the police on him because he had threatened her with a utility knife. When the cops arrived, he refused to put the weapon down and was also shot and killed. Similarly, in August of that very same year, Kiwi Herring cut a neighbor with a knife during an altercation, and when police arrived, she slashed a cop across the arm and continued to swipe at them, which, as you probably guessed, led to them shooting and killing her. All three of the previous individuals were trans, and their deaths were immediately tallied on the Human Rights Campaign's list of murdered transgender people, a list, by the way, which is cited as anti-transgender violence, and it's this source which is cited by almost every media organization as proof of a rising trend in trans-related hate crime. But as you just heard, Sean Hake, Scout Schultz, and Kiwi Herring were not killed for being trans. They were killed for charging police with knives. They just happened to be trans. And that action they took was an act which resulted in non-trans people being shot and killed for the very same reason during that very same year. I understand it would be easy to pick 3 deaths on any list to downplay the severity of a situation, so keeping the 2017 list in mind, a list by the way which only contains 29 people, let's quickly explore some of these other deaths. Kashmir Nazir Red was killed by his partner in what the HRC describes as an incident of domestic violence. Going so far as to write, this tragedy is the latest reminder that the transgender community is disproportionately represented in domestic violence cases across the country, and more must be done to support those experiencing intimate partner violence. There's a bit of a snag though. Kashmir was the instigator, and his partner stabbed him in self-defense. She was eventually cleared of all charges. Being trans had nothing to do with it, a common theme throughout every year's list. Consider again, from 2017, Rhiannon Leyendecker. She was tragically killed in an act of domestic violence by her transgender partner. Sad, yes, but an anti-trans related hate crime? Doubtful, considering her partner was also trans. Going through the majority of deaths on the 2017 list, the one which journalists during 2018 would have been citing, it becomes clear there's almost no evidence of them being related to the victim's gender identity. In only a small few cases is gender the verifiable cause, and by that I mean to say they're legitimate hate crimes, because yes, it does obviously still happen. And this isn't just 2017 either. I'm not lying through omission. Consider 2019, a year I've previously reported on. Claire Legato was shot after trying to break up a fight between her mother and a neighbor. Jordan Kofer was just one of 9 people killed in the Dayton, Ohio mass shooting. A tragic situation to be sure, but not a murder motivated by his status as a trans person. Johanna Medina died after facing health complications while in custody of ICE. Layleen Palinko died from complications with epilepsy while being held at Rikers Island. Bailey Reeves was shot and killed but is not believed to have been the intended target. Finally, there is Bubba Walker, who died in a house fire. It's being investigated as a potential homicide, but as of now, there is no definitive proof one way or the other. Even Jazelyn Ware remained on the list for over a year, even though she died of natural causes. The short and narrow of it is that the transgender murder rate is bunk, and the majority of journalists citing it as proof of an increase in hate crime are not doing their due diligence and digging into the facts. Made worse are the politicians who repeatedly cite it whilst chasing down the LGBT voter bloc. It is fear-mongering propaganda, pure and simple, and the media is complicit, whether they realize it or not. Returning to the realm of gaming, by now, the wheels were starting to come off the bus where Cyberpunk 2077 was concerned, and the media amped up its attacks on the supposed lack of trans representation. Sam Greer at Rock Paper Shotgun would write that adhering to the gender binary was a failure of imagination, while also citing the transphobic tweet as if to imply the game was created by bigots. I call out her piece specifically because the interesting thing about Sam Greer is that she's in no position to be discussing anything trans-related given her massive slip-up while reviewing RimWorld for PC Gamer. In her review, she lashed out at the game's heteronormativity before describing backstories of its trans characters as reductive. The kicker? Sam Greer isn't trans, and the trans stories she writes off as heteronormative were written by actual trans people. They were financial backers of the game who had an opportunity to submit their own stories. It was their own personal tales. Something Sam said left a bad taste in her mouth. And this is one of the problems with many inside game media. They maintain an extremely rigid worldview on how trans people are supposed to act and carry themselves. Something one could argue is in fact transphobic itself. It's why I roll my eyes every time they tout the need for authentic trans characters, because they shit on them every time an authentic trans person moves off their well-defined path. I've used this example in previous videos, but consider the Red Strings Club. On January 22nd, 2018, Waypoint tweeted out an article with the caption, "Don't dead name, ever." The accompanying article made the bold proclamation that the tiny indie game The Red Strings Club falls into a pitfall of transphobia. This is because, near the end of the experience, it's revealed that a character is trans after their dead name, aka their name from before they transitioned, is used as a sort of reveal that the protagonist is trans. Within the story, it makes sense because it's a password used by an abusive ex. And, shocker, an abusive ex probably wouldn't respect the gender identity of their former partner. Regardless though, the Vice piece describes the reveal as offensive, before also stating how the game enters the territory of the hypersexualized trans woman trope. Now for the kicker I know you're highly anticipating. The Red Strings Club was developed by a small team of 3 people, and one of them is trans. The author of the Vice piece is not. This in turn led to a lot of outrage understandably being directed Vice's way, and in a follow-up article based on a discussion the author had with the game developer, she still doubles down on the experience being transphobic. I know by now some of you are tired of these tangents, but it's important to stress the rigidity of the gaming media's worldview as it pertains to trans people. Time and time again, they describe stuff as transphobic, even when a trans person had a hand in its creation. They continually go to absurd lengths to decry content as transphobic. And these accusations lead to real-world abuse of the people they target. The trans woman who worked on the Red Strings Club? Yeah, she got bullied for it. And as you're about to see, the media's insistence on creating narratives can lead to the real-world doxing of others. Enter the third Twitter controversy. On October 23rd, 2018, the GOG Twitter account made use of a hashtag. And if earlier the wheels were already starting to fall off the bus, it's here that the damn thing exploded. Due to a New York Times article which claimed the legal definition of gender was going to be rewritten as a means for the Trump administration to target trans people, a hashtag kicked off on Twitter called #Won'tBeErased. At the time, Sean Halliday was a social media manager for GOG, and in his time on the platform, he had elevated the company's Twitter account by bringing extra personality to its tweets. As would be revealed by Eurogamer, one way he did this was by piggybacking off of popular hashtags. Going through the history of the account, this can easily be verified, and as he would tell it, one night he saw the hashtag #Won'tBeErased, and so he clicked on it to see what it was about, and he saw people talking about their favorite games, songs, movies, and stuff of that sort. So thinking it'd be perfect for the GOG account, he tweeted, "PC games won't be erased on our watch." Yeah, how's that for some use of hashtags? After it got posted, someone alerted Sean to the hashtag's true meaning, so understanding what he'd done, he very quickly nuked it and alerted his manager to the situation. But speed didn't matter here, because the outrage was faster, and this time it would take casualties as Sean very quickly lost his job. On the one hand, I can sort of understand his firing. I don't agree with it, but I can understand it. It had been Sean who'd made the Postal 2-year nation gif, and while it was totally unfair of the media to react as it did, especially given what Postal 2 even is, it has to be understood that within any company, someone will always be left holding the bag where bad PR is to be involved. Clearly after the GIF, his job was safe and they moved on. In his words, he even got permission before posting it. But with the onslaught of attacks from the media in the months afterward, and with the CDPR social team making a blunder of its own, pressure was probably high, and the Won't Be Erased incident was just one incident too far. The tragedy here is that Sean doesn't seem like a malicious person. In a very revealing piece, he opened up to Eurogamer about not just the ordeal, but his time at the company, and he comes off as a bright young man who had good ideas where 99% of the content was concerned. When he was brought into the company, it tasked him with cleaning the toxicity of its forum, so he suggested banning politics, and within a month it saw results, something GOG was happy with. So following his forum success, he moved into the social media side of things, and it was here that he thought it best to inject personality and energy into the feeds, and one way he did this was by piggybacking trending hashtags. A tactic that worked, at least, until it didn't. When broken down and looked at with a critical eye, it's obvious he did nothing wrong. Hashtags are often created for singular purposes, but they never remain singular. Almost immediately, people inject their own ideas into them, and they evolve. And should one browse the Won't Be Erased tag, there are tweets discussing games and films and other forms of media. Keep in mind, Sean was living in Poland, and likely wasn't paying much attention to the New York Times or even American social causes. Yet where the media is to be concerned, nuance and context don't matter. And immediately they decried GOG as transphobic. And where accusations of bigotry are involved, anger is close to follow. And with anger comes toxicity and abuse. And the deeper tragedy of Sean is that not only did he lose his job, but his parents' house got doxxed. And people began calling their homes with threats and harassment. This, the result of the media's insistence that an honest mistake was an act of bigotry. As for Sean, after losing his self-described dream job, he was eventually forced to move back to his home country, leaving his girlfriend behind. As 2018 rolled into 2019 and the months continued to wane on, the outrage against CP2077 only grew. With the 3 Twitter incidents and the lack of gender-fluid options in the game, the media went on the offensive. Articles would often cite the company's history with air quotes, transphobia, the lack of malicious intent be damned. But then, in the summer of 2019, things began going truly insane. In early June, Nvidia announced it was partnering with CDPR, and during the reveal, multiple screenshots of CP2077 were released. Within one of the images was a series of advertisements a player would find throughout the world, and it was one of these fictional adverts that triggered the media in such a way as to almost be unbelievable. The fictional ad depicted a beautiful woman in a leotard shilling a drink called Chromanticore, but under her leotard was a blatantly obvious and massive penis. As I'll get to in a moment, this makes sense within the context of the game itself, but as is to be expected, the media immediately labeled it transphobic. In an interview with Polygon, the artist behind the artwork explained the meaning. She told the publication that the intention was never to offend anyone, and that within the world of Cyberpunk, it shows how bodies of all types are used by corporations to sell products. She goes even further to highlight how the player should not see this kind of advertising as good. It's a dystopian future where mega corporations dictate everything, going to extreme lengths to influence people's lives. This being achieved with aggressive advertisement and abuse. So in that sense, hypersexualization is everywhere, and it's people of all body types and genders being sexualized. Should one play the game, it's pretty fucking obvious the artist was telling the truth behind the image's intent. To quote my own review here, all the art assets blend together to tie the lore and the environments into one beautiful package. It feels like a grungy future city, and the way sex and drugs are plastered everywhere really suits it. This is a future where humanity has given into its vices to an excessive extreme. Speed is advertised on TV, television series are all about banging, and, speaking of sex, nudity and fetishes are used to sell every product under the sun. A trans woman with a throbbing penis under her leotard selling a drink is just as normal to see as naked women or men showing various other products, usually with some form of kink mixed in, because here, people don't want to think. They want to escape. They want an endless stream of quick-hit vices, a life choice pushed by the heavily corporatized world that is all too ready to enable them." End quote. Please take that all in. The world is rife with sex, and crack cocaine is literally advertised on TV. Even obese men are sexualized, a far cry from our current reality. It's sickly inclusive. It's a future that doesn't care if one's fat, trans, gay, or whatever else. All people care about is that they can escape, which isn't good. It's a poor form of inclusivity, but it's a fucking dystopia. It's not supposed to be good. But as you're all too well aware, should you have made it this far into the video, intent and context don't matter, and the media lost its collective shit. Writing for the Daily Dot, outrage monger and trans journalist Anna Valens, someone you may recognize from my Ion Fury coverage, would dig up tired rhetoric and call the artwork a dog whistle in an article headlined, "Deeply transphobic ad in Cyberpunk 2077 represents everything wrong with Cyberpunk." Within it, she goes in all sorts of directions. She laments that the ad fetishizes the owner's genitals before saying it embraces harmful stereotypes because many trans women cannot maintain erections. This, she argues, furthers a stigma reinforced by cis male-centric porn? I don't fucking know. But let me say from experience, and I hate that I gotta go here, but not all trans people have an improperly functioning penis. And let's just end it there. Continuing on with Valens' piece, she ties the 3 tweets from the previous year into it as some sort of proof that the ad is malicious. She then cites another trans journalist, and it's here we must go on a detour through the mind of another crazy person. Writing for Checkpoint Gaming, Haley McKay also complains about the hypersexualization and fetishization of trans women in the advert. But where that rhetoric is just annoying, she enters full-on loony territory when she brings up a supposed trope about how trans characters are often depicted as victims. And because the artist expressed a dislike of corporations using bodies to sell commercial goods, she therefore expressed that the model in the advert is in need of rescuing from the clutches of a big bad megacorp, thus engaging with the anti-trans victimhood trope. Are you fucking serious? That is the level of mental gymnastics they are pushing their brains through to come up with reasons to be outraged. It's ridiculous. And backing it back up to Valens, it's immensely hypocritical. As she complained about the image being transphobic because it fetishizes a trans body in multiple articles in 2019 and 2020, it's important to note that she tweeted her own nude pics to her main Twitter account, including dick pics. She also created a secondary Twitter for yet even more smut, and she has an OnlyFans account where she posts lewd content. On top of that, she's made zines which feature trans women engaging in sexual acts. But oh no, it doesn't end there, dear friends. Last year, she wrote an article about playing Fall Guys with a butt plug that reacted to in-game actions, and so she ran around hugging other players as to experience those good vibrations. She's also argued that public sex is vital to the queer experience. Unable to end it there, she argues that it's transphobic for straight people to not engage in sexual acts with trans people. I'm almost at a loss of words. Who is fetishizing trans people here again? Shortly after the hubbub surrounding Chromanticore, via an interview with Gamasutra, a designer in the game revealed the studio is working on transgender player options within CP 2077. Just a couple months later, it was officially confirmed to have been a success, as during an interview with Metro, a representative from the company revealed that players would no longer choose a gender. Instead, they'd pick a body type and go from there. The media celebrated this as a huge win for the LGBT community, with some publications like The Next Web stating it was an important move for the company to make, considering CDPR was already on shaky ground with the LGBT community and its allies, because you know, all gay people are one big monolithic entity. The celebrations wouldn't last long, however, and it was only a matter of time until it came out that while players could choose a body type and even customize their genitals as they saw fit, pronouns were still tied to voice, with the female voice being she, her, and a male voice obviously being he, him. Writing once again for the Daily Dot, Anna Valens would rear her head into the conversation, and in a piece titled "Cyberpunk 2077 is coming, remember to listen to trans people about its problems," she would tear into the voice options, writing that the studio still let cis-sexist assumptions lead the creation process before then asking why they linked gender to voice, suggesting that it sends a poor message to trans people. The biggest disconnect here being that she opens up her article by trashing the company for its culture of crunch. Yet here she is demanding the studio spend more time and money on this alleged problem, which, as you hopefully remember from the top of the video, is no quick and easy feat. Yet every fucking journalist and blogger can't seem to comprehend this. As an additional example, Bella Blondu wrote for The Gamer that the voice options are a nightmare made virtual, stating how the gender options within the game are probably in bad faith because having pronouns linked to voice is one of the most toxic things one can do to determine someone's gender. She even calls it an insidious attack on trans personhood. At every turn, they seem to have forgotten what fantasy is. There are two protagonist voices in the game. It can't possibly depict every nuance of gender, nor should it even have to. It's entitlement from the toxic fucking side of the transgender community. I mean, we don't see deep-voiced biological women losing it because the female option isn't voiced as deeply as them. No! Within gaming, you accept certain concessions. And as far as Cyberpunk 2077 goes, it went further than most. You can be a chick with a dick or a man with a vagina, but that was never going to be enough to appease the entitled side of the gaming medium, because they don't want appeasement. They want grievance. They want victimhood. And more importantly, they want to be bullies. Like, come on. The mental gymnastics around the alleged trans victimhood trope really, there was no satisfying them. There were always going to be grievances to dig up, and oh boy, was there going to be a lot of digging. In an article on Gamer headlined, "The Cyberpunk 2077 romance weren't made for trans people," trans writer Stacey Henley complains that while walking throughout the world with no pants on, she couldn't look down to see her penis. This, she expresses as proof that trans people were othered all the way down, and that CDPR didn't respect trans identities. The thing is though, regardless of if your character is trans or not, at the time of release, no genitals could be seen outside of the menu. Everyone had underwear on while wandering the open world. Sticking with Stacey for a bit, in another article published on PC Gamer, she complained that her character was trans, but that the world wasn't, expressing that it's problematic how binary it was because there's still clearly defined gender norms. But gender norms aren't a trans thing, and most trans people fit into those norms. Trans women, typically, although yes, not always, fit into feminine roles, and trans men into masculine ones. Yet Stacey goes on to complain about the lack of non-binary pronouns and the fact that voice is tied to pronouns. I'm not gonna dive into all the articles here, but Stacey would write about CP 2077 and its handling of trans issues for the aforementioned Gamer and PC Gamer, but also The Gamer, Wired, VG247, Fanbyte, and Polygon. The latter piece being perhaps the most over the top, but I honestly don't know if there's good enough reason to thoroughly go over it. Similar to all the coverage coming from the countless major websites, it's mostly a greatest hits of the same tired rhetoric. It brings up the Chromanticore ad, stating that she doesn't buy the artist's intent, because clearly it can only be transphobia. She then cites the history of tweets, once again labeling them as transphobic, only to swerve back to the Chromanticore poster by saying it conjures up transphobic images and ideas that are responsible for real-world harm to trans people. The piece then ends with more discussions about how transphobic the character creator is because of voice stuff. It cannot be overstated just how many websites repeated this rhetoric. There were no alternative points of view at any of the mainstream gaming websites. In digging through articles, it becomes apparent just how alive and well copy-paste journalism currently is. Even alternative gaming websites largely fell in line. Double Jump would write how the road to Cyberpunk was a transphobic mess, to which Junkie, Boing Boing, Screen Rant, Game Rant, Comic Book Resource, but why though? Den of Geek, Them, and countless others went the same route. A list which doesn't include the usual suspects such as IGN, Kotaku, Polygon, GameSpot, Vice, The Daily Dot, Time Magazine, Variety, Rock Paper Shotgun, The Gamer, PC Gamer, PC Games N, Paste Magazine, VG247, Game Revolution, Gaming, and the list goes on. I could name sites all day, but you get the idea. The medium is stagnant and one-sided, and for as much as they want to deny it being otherwise, the proof is in the pudding, or in this case, the bold claims that CP 2077 was transphobic. By the time Cyberpunk 2077 finally released to the public, the discourse was a complete clusterfuck. Comic Book Resource published an article in December 2020 headlined, "How Cyberpunk 2077 Perpetuates Transphobia and Why Gamers Are Calling It an Act of Violence." And it's both batshit and genuinely hilarious in how off-base some of it is. It begins with claims that its portrayal of trans characters is anything but progressive, a telling statement in its own right, but one which doesn't take into account Claire. I mentioned her way earlier in this video, and now is a good time to elaborate upon her character. Claire is one of the best, if not the very best trans characters I have ever seen in a video game. Her writing is realistic and down to earth, and the revelation about her gender is earnest and earned. You get it only after building trust with her. Unlike something like Mass Effect Andromeda, which had a trans NPC who for no reason at all just told the player they are trans, Claire only reveals her gender towards the end of her arc and in a manner that makes sense. Sure, there's clues about her identity such as a trans flag on her truck, but she is a fully realized character and not a trope. She is also voiced by an actual trans person, which is quite rare within gaming, especially within the AAA space. And as a trans person, I valued her placement within the game, more so because it's not heavy-handed or political. She doesn't preach at the player, and even CDPR avoided falling into the representation trap. And by this I mean she wasn't a marketing token to earn diversity points, and I respect that a lot. Returning to the CBR piece, as is to be expected, they say the character creator is bona fide transphobia, but my favorite bit is where they state that CP2077 has no meaningful LGBTQ representation. First off, multiple side characters are gay, with one major character, Judy, being a lesbian. Then there's the aforementioned Claire. What makes this hilarious is when the author says, "It seems odd that reviewers who have played anywhere from 40 to 60 hours have yet to encounter any meaningful trans NPCs." Yeah, sure, super odd. Almost as if most reviewers aren't very good at their job. But we'll get to that later. The most galling bit of the article is where she goes on about how trans people are among the most at risk for hate crimes in the US. A lie I already tore down earlier, but one which festers because it moves into Jack Thompson-esque rhetoric by suggesting CP2077 could result in real-world anti-transgender violence. That bullshit idea isn't exclusive to this stupid website either, as Polygon suggested it too, as did others. Another being The Gamer, where the author of the piece said they fear for the game because they're worried someone will take the wrong idea from it, which manifests in a violent action that steals the life of a trans sister. As a quick note, notice how the author doesn't fear for trans men. Selfish? No? Anyways, in the many months since release, no trans person has yet been murdered because of Cyberpunk 2077, or any video game for that matter. After multiple years of disingenuous rage-baiting articles and hit pieces, reviews of the actual game weren't much better. There are actually kind of interesting beasts within their own right. There were the typical 10s out of 10s, some from sites which were actively advertising the game on the day it came out, which is highly questionable considering the actual state of the game at launch, but I'm not going to get into that within this video. As for the other reviews, they were deeply political. Polygon, for instance, would go on to mention trans stuff 21 times. By now, I can gloss over most of it because without seeing it, you already know what it brings up, so I'll only focus on a few things. The writer, Carolyn Petit, says she never met a trans character, meaning she didn't complete Claire's quests. And she also says she only encountered one queer-coded character, that being an unsavory surgeon, which is odd because Judy is a main side character within the game, and a lesbian relationship of hers takes center stage. It's a bafflingly incorrect review which calls into question the author's critical prowess. Her analysis misses so very much, even misunderstanding why the trans billboards are sexualized as they are. Keeping with the reviews, GameSpot says the player can't be authentically trans, whatever that means. Vice would bang up its transphobic marketing, and The Verge, Keen Gamer, Time Magazine, RPG Fan, and The Washington Post would all touch upon trans stuff in one way or another. Metro would also complain about the lack of transgender characters because fuck Claire's missions, I guess. The website would also call out the game's unwillingness to engage with transgender issues, because sure, for some reason this was the game that needed to address gender politics. A sentiment shared by Kotaku which straight up complains that it doesn't feel as if the developers wanted to specifically address queerness and transness. A blatant admittance that what the gaming press seeks is political affirmation. They want their games to be vessels for promoting their activist agendas, but as shown multiple times now, even when a game contains what they seek, it's never good enough. Even the aforementioned Polygon review, which spends the first 7 paragraphs focusing on trans issues, still somehow manages to spend the presentation of a trans flag within the game as a bad thing. Representation, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Being that I'm trans myself, I take issue with all of this. There is no single entity more significantly harmful to the widespread acceptance as trans people than the overly woke crowd. Maybe this is hyperbole, I don't know, but put me in a room with 1 woke person and 9 actual bigots, and I guarantee you, if that single woke person has access to Twitter, then they're doing more widespread harm to people like me than whatever insults the other 9 may levy my way. This never-ending cycle of outrage only serves to make trans people appear mentally unstable. It is further unaided by the fact that any and everything is enough to get a person labeled a bigot. It is peak insanity, and it is emblematic of a group of self-made victims who would rather burn bridges than build them. Everything they do, the non-stop toxicity and whining and anger, only pushes potential allies away. And I honestly can't blame normal people for up and walking away. I wouldn't want to associate with the people I'm lumped in by default with. How can I possibly expect others to? Back to the Cyberpunk issue at hand, none of the anger stands up to scrutiny. It is a mix of entitlement and warped worldviews to the extreme. No game owes anybody socio-political affirmation, and we now have a gaming press that doesn't view titles based on the merits of being a good game, but instead on whether it contains a set amount of activism. And if a game doesn't meet a set very, very far left quota, they have proven time and time again they will trash it unless it conforms. These thrashings don't even make logical sense. Consider again the fake advertisement in 2077. It depicts a woman with a bulging penis under her leotard promoting a drink. It is being painted as transphobia because it fetishizes trans people, but it actually is a depiction of peak equality. Open your eyes and take a look at any of the billboards and adverts that surround us. Men and women are constantly sexualized and objectified in order to sell products, and so in a future where a woman can proudly show off her big dick energy, that clearly means society's accepting of such people. That is not transphobia, that is normalization. Although being that far-flung future to the dystopia, that's, hopefully we can get a better form of normalization, but you get my point. But continuing on, the problem with normalization is that it means victim status goes bye-bye, and the current vocal minority within the trans community thrives off of being victims. They don't want equal treatment, they want special treatment. It's why they are reviving decades-old debunked claims that video games lead to violence. They have not a care in the world for rational thought. They would rather just be angry. They would rather just be emotional, because emotions bring attention. No different than a child crying in a store aisle because mommy said no to buying them a $100 toy. As for the gaming press, they are using this predilection for attention to push very, very far left ideals. They are a propaganda machine, pure and simple. Toe the ideological line or get smeared. They are running an operation meant to scare game developers into giving them what they want. Pay attention to how they weaponize their platforms. Also pay attention to how they deflect any and all criticism. Earlier in the video I shelved a point, and now it's time to open the box. As trans writers were publishing legitimate lies and making absurd claims that the game would get them killed, people naturally pushed back. It's an obviously unsubstantiated claim, made worse as their other bold statements were manipulative and dishonest. But any and all criticism was written off as transphobic abuse, and then spun as proof that gamers have it out for marginalized identities, thus proving that CDPR in Cyberpunk was catering to a toxic crowd. I myself got called transphobic for calling out their BS. Yet for them, it's a tried and true tactic. It's the same way they deflect valid criticisms towards Zoe Quinn or History of Lies and her Kickstarter scam. And it's the same tactic they use to write off criticism of other writers. And if that's not a sign of how they propagate lies, then I don't know what is. This clique has a boot on the throat of the gaming industry, and thanks to the massive platforms they're in control of, none of their lies and smear tactics cost them anything of consequence. Thankfully for CDPR's sake, Cyberpunk was so big the press couldn't do much damage no matter how they tried. Not to mention CDPR damaged themselves by putting out an unfinished game. But that aside, consider smaller developers who can't survive without the aid of the press. This is where it's time for gamers to step up. Push back against all of this. That's not to suggest you buy bad games or promote ones which carry little worth, but for those titles which do make for a good time, promote, buy, and discuss them. Show solidarity with studios that the media accurately paints as villains. It is time to strip them of their influence. Let all these sites crush themselves under the weight of their own hubris. It is frankly time to kill the cancer, because the longer it festers, the more this medium will rot. And nearly an hour later, I guess that's mostly it. There was never a good reason Cyberpunk needed to be the game that explored issues in transgenderism, but through forceful means, that became the defining narrative of its development cycle. And as I said at the very top, this story contains it all, and I know this was an immensely long video, but the subject touches up on nearly everything I've spent the past 4 years highlighting. I mean, really, Consider it all. The CP-2077 trans debacle contains the misuse of the trans murder rate, the role of Zoe Quinn in weaponizing the media, the disingenuous nature of Gamergate coverage, the weaponization of various identities, the ideologically one-sided nature of the gaming press, the gaming clique, the role of Reset Air in contributing to controversies, the stagnation of the media, the activist side of the media, the unwarranted attacks on innocent victims, the predilection for rage bait, the role a vocal minority plays in making trans people seem insane, and the list goes on and on and on. It's not an understatement to say that this story is ultimately the culmination of 4 years worth of my own work, and in that sense, it was important for me to share. I hope you agree. I assume if you made it this far, you do, and for that, I thank you. Now don't mind me, I'm gonna go pass out. You wouldn't believe how many hours I put into this fucker. Adios.